This is for you, Maddie Sopkovich. She was the one who asked about it. Okay, so I wanted to review types of natural selection with you guys because there were a number of students that were still confused on it. And basically, there's 3 different types of natural selection. There's directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. And these are the graphs that are associated with each type. And you guys will definitely need to know these graphs for the test. With directional natural selection, a way to describe this is that it pays to be different. Okay, it pays to be different. That means that out of all of these traits, think of this curve as all the different traits for some specific characteristic of a species. If it is directional natural selection, what will happen is one end or an extreme of that trait is the one that's more fitting for that environment at that particular time. And as a result, that more fitting characteristic is one that enables their survival. And so the ones that don't have that fitting trait, what's going to happen, you guys? Death. You're going to see a drop in numbers because they won't survive to pass on that gene. So these arrows right here and right here are arrows that represent the environmental pressures pushing down on those numbers of individuals with that trait, while this extreme trait is actually going to go up. And we see that in this little graph here, as time passes, that the frequency of individuals with that particular trait that's fitting for the environment at that time increases in number. You can see it right here. So with this, it actually pays to be different because in the beginning here, they weren't very abundant. But then over time, if they became more abundant, that extreme trait. And somebody asked, I don't know if it was this class or another class, could directional natural selection go the other way? Yes, it can. So if there was a trait that was at this end of the spectrum, so you could also see a graph the other way. Do you guys get it? So it's just not the norm of the trait. Then in stabilizing selection, it pays to be normal. Okay? So normal means that the bell curve, where the top is right here, this is the normal range of the population. Most of the individuals in this entire population have this trait. Okay, over time, pressure is put on the extremes because that particular trait at that particular time in that environment is not good. So those numbers decrease and we see more of the normal range. And so that means it pays to be normal. So that's stabilizing. And then we also have disruptive natural selection where both extremes are favored. Okay? So it doesn't pay to be normal in this type of situation. Okay? Because the normal range right here is actually being acted upon by the environmental conditions. The environmental conditions the adaptation for the middle one is not suitable for the environmental conditions at that time. So that those numbers will decrease to the point where the extremes will increase. Okay? And out of all 3 of these, this one can lead to speciation, which is the creation of a new species, like 2 different species. They will diverge. Yes?
What's the main difference between directional and disruptive?
In directional, one trait is the preferred.
And they can be
And in disruptive, both traits actually are suitable. Okay? Both extremes. Yes?
Are there any examples you can think of for disruptive?
Sure. With disruptive selection, an example of this could be the Galapagos finches. we started out with a population of finches that were pretty much all the same. Some slight differences here and there. This was your norm, okay? But then over evolutionary time, we're talking millions of years, these birds migrated to different islands. Each island had different ecosystems. And as a result, the extremes of a trait for the finch species, like maybe beak density, okay, or beak length. So this could be maybe all beaks. This could be short beaks, medium beaks, long beaks, or something. They adapted to those different islands over time, and each island had a specific food source. And as a result, the extreme traits of adaptation were selected over time. I don't know if that makes any sense. If everybody can make a fist right now, really quick, and everybody go like this and make like a high five. Okay, so fist and high five. The fist is like the original finch. Arrives to the Galapagos from South America. That's where they propose they came from. All those finches came to the Galapagos Islands, and then they discovered, wow, there's not just one island in the Galapagos. There's like all these other islands. So let's fly there. So they flew there, and so imagine like your whole palm. Yeah, could do that. Your whole palm represents 5 islands. Okay, so each finger is a different island, and each island has a different food source. And if that finch, once it got there, didn't adapt over time to the food source, it would die out. So what we find is that these extremes, here and here, maybe had favorable adaptations for that particular food source at that time. And it leads to speciation. So I don't know if that helps. Lauren? Yes?
There's different ways to like does it only happen with natural selection, or there's other ways?
There's other ways too. The question was, does speciation occur just with disruptive selection? And the answer is no, it can happen in other ones as well. With directional selection, this could be to the point where like a whole new species is isolated from the original population. A way that this can happen is with the influx of some environmental catastrophe or environmental occurrence, like the building of a mountain. And the mountain reproductively isolates that population from the other population, and then they kind of are isolated, and they adapt over millions of years to that isolated environment. So these other types of selection can lead to speciation, but it's also coupled with some type of environmental thing that isolates them. Okay, and we'll actually get into that in a couple slides with reproductive isolation. Okay. I have no idea how many minutes I'm at. That's one thing I don't like about this, because it cuts you off at 15 minutes, and I can just keep talking, and I don't realize that I'm not being recorded anymore. So we already went over all of this stuff with Miss Miller, and I'm going to jump ahead, keep going, keep going. Okay, I think this is where we are. Population genetics. This slide is kind of overwhelming. I want you to understand that there's only a couple things we need to know out of this. What I want you to understand out of population genetics is the fact that evolution works on populations. It does not work on individuals. Okay? Evolution works on populations. What I've underlined is the key thing, are the key things you need to write down. That's it, out of all this. This stuff you're not going to have to know, but I do want to expose you to the fact that there is math involved with population genetics. And the math involved is based on a principle called the Hardy-Weinberg principle, which looks at the dominant and recessive traits in populations of organisms, and like which ones become more dominant in the populations and which ones become less dominant in the population. You are not going to have to know any of this stuff, okay? I just wanted to expose you to it, okay?
So what things you want to
So the only thing you have to know is that evolution works on populations, not on individuals. Does that make sense? So an example of that could be like the Lorax. Where's my Lorax?
Right over there.
Where is he?
There.
Oh, okay. He's hiding. Here's the Lorax.
He's checking.
And if I were to say that this Lorax were to evolve in its lifetime, and let's say growing a ruler out of its head was a great adaptation, could that happen?
No.
No. Could growing a ruler out of its head, it's just, you know, it's not really going to happen, but we'll just pretend. Could it happen in like a couple thousand years possibly?
No.
Okay, could it happen in millions of years?
No.
Yes, okay? Because it takes time for those traits to be passed on. So the ones that don't have rulers coming out of their heads would die out in the populations, whereas the ones that had the genes for rulers coming out of the heads would become more prevalent in the population and therefore live long enough to reproduce and pass on that gene. Okay? So just a little example. Yes?
What if like something like over time like gets something, but then like to like make it like more like adapt to live somewhere, but then like everything changes and like kind of like lose it again? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, it could lead to the extinction of that those individuals with that trait from that population. And so therefore then that gene is no longer in the population to be passed on in future generations.
So it could come and go. Like,
Yeah, it
within,
could come
like,
and go.
thousands of years.
It's just like, have you ever heard of like traits that skip generations?
Yeah.
Like you might have biological traits that are from like your great grandmother or something. I mean, that happens. That's why they call DNA the immortal thread, because it like never really dies. It just continues to live and be passed on generation after generation, even if you don't even possess the characteristic. You could pass it on to your offspring, which is crazy. It's pretty deep. I need to see like how many. No, I don't want to do that. I want to see how many